Well, hello, and a very warm
Hi.
welcome back to the Andrew Eborn Show with me, Andrew Eborn. Who else? Well, I'll tell you who else. Today, joined by Michael Gelardi, English singer, keyboard player, composer, arranger, entertainment executive, and restaurateur. Michael, there is no end to the list of your talents. How are you?
Well, I'm not really a restaurateur, Andrew. I happen to be involved in restaurants. That's about it.
Well, I've been looking at your career, and this is why I'm so delighted to look at all the different interviews that you've given over the years in different capacities. You did co-own a restaurant in Bournemouth, is that right?
That's right. Yes, it was had the rather dubious name of Flirt. Quite good name, I thought, actually.
It's a great
Um,
name. How did you come up with that, and why was it called Flirt?
well, we bought it. A partner of mine and I. He lives in Bournemouth, and he is a restaurateur. He ran as the Dexo Prestige, which is a very big catering business. Um, yeah, and he approached me with it, and so we put on various artists there, and for a couple of years, and then COVID came along, so we shut it. And then he got a rather good offer to sell it, so that was that.
Oh no,
But as
brilliant.
you
Well,
know,
well, that
I was managing director of a Trust House Forte division, and we owned 3,000 restaurants then, um, and 880 hotels and a lot of other things. But so I've been involved in the restaurant business, and my family have been involved in the hotel business for three generations. It's quite a sort of coffee table, quite a substantial book that's just come out about the Gelardi Hotel dynasty, um, which doesn't say very much about me.
well, you're going to rectify that. Apart from being a regular on the Andrew Eborn show, you're also writing your autobiography or being helped with that. And what a tale it is. But I want to take you back to the beginning, Michael, because it's always fascinating how people start. You talked about your family, and they always say, "Show me a child," or "Give me a child to the age of 7, and I'll show you the man." And what do you remember of your childhood?
It was an extremely happy one. I was born in South Africa in Durban, and my father then he was a hotelier, and he ran the best hotel in Durban at the time, the Edward Hotel, which is where I was born. Um, on the Marine Parade, it was a lovely area, and we had a country house as well. And we lived a very happy childhood. My mother and father were, I have to, were wonderful people. And we then moved to Johannesburg, and we lived. I think it must have been about 5 years. Then when I was 11, they decided that, with apartheid and the things that were going on there, South Africa might not be the best place to live anymore. Thank goodness. And actually, it's quite a strange story. My father, they then decided we would go to America, and my father got himself a job at the famous Fontainebleau Hotel, or Fountain Blue, as the Americans call it, um, uh, in um, in Florida, and flew over there to basically to seal the deal, as what maybe Mr. Trump might say. Um, and anyway, but in those days, of course, you couldn't fly from. This was 1960, 61. You couldn't fly directly to Florida from Johannesburg, so you had to come via London. And he stayed with his brother, my uncle Arthur, who was quite a big noise in those days in the film business, in the Italian film business. And he stayed a couple of nights, then flew on to the States. And he was there 3 or 4 days, did the necessary, and got the job. And but the night before, it's amazing how serendipity cuts into your life. The night before he flew back, my uncle and aunt um, attended a dinner at Grosvenor House, an Italian hospital charity. The Italian hospital charity was a big thing with the Italians in this country. And Charles and Forte and his wife were there, and my uncle and aunt sat next to them at the table. And Charles Forte had bought the Café Royal. He owned the Café Royal, and he'd just bought his first hotel, the Waldorf, in London. And but he wasn't a hotelier; he was a caterer. Basically, he classed himself as. And he was talking to my uncle, and the Italians in those days, knew what everybody else did, and amongst their community. And Charles Forley said, "Your family are well known in the hotel business, aren't they, Mr. Gelardi?" He said, "Well, yes, they are. I'm not in the hotel." I said, "Well, do you know anyone that could help me? Because I've just bought my first hotel, and I'm not a hotelier." Excuse me. And he said, "Well, my brother actually was Savoy trained because my grandfather ran the Savoy in the early days, the Savoy and Claridge's." He said, I think he's got a job now, but he'll be arriving in the next couple of days back here to stay with me, and I can ask him to call you." And anyway, he did, and the rest is history, as I say. We weren't going to America; we were coming to England,
Right.
to help Charles Forte start his hotel company, which became, as you probably know, the biggest in the world at the time. So that's how I got here, anyway.
Right. And it's fascinating the story because whilst you're here, you've been dabbling in all sides of the entertainment industry. I want to talk about your music first of all, though, because you began your career in music at a very young age. You studied classical piano and organ from the age of 8. Talk to me about your musical training and how that shaped your early career.
No, it was all private, actually. I had a very good teacher in South Africa. My first teacher in Durban was a very sweet lady. I remember her vaguely. My first memory of it was my mother hauling me out of uh, um, Over the Rainbow, the Wizard of Oz film, in the middle of it to go to my piano lesson, which I was very upset about. As I've since watched the rest of it, actually, but a few times. Um, but then in Johannesburg, I had an excellent concert pianist called Mrs. Blueway, who was very tough on me, and I didn't like it. Um, and I'd say to my mother, she's hurt my hands.
Oh, she used to hit you, did she?
No, 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 no. Just the piano exercises I had to
Oh,
do.
right. Okay.
No, no, no. She didn't have a ruler or anything. It wasn't that bad. Um, but anyway, that gave me my technique, which I'm always grateful. I didn't like it at all, and I tried to ask my mother to stop my lessons, but she wouldn't, quite rightly. And then here I had another piano teacher, another classical pianist lady who was okay, not quite so good, but basically I learned, I from sort of 8 to 13, I learned to play. I learned classical music, not jazz or blues or anything. But then at about 13, I got interested in those other things, and started learning them. And I had a very good technique, a keyboard technique, and so they came, and I also have, I think, quite good musical feel for jazz and blues and things like that. I sort of spanned all those things. I was sort of not necessarily a complete master of any of them, but I could do them.
And do you remember? I mean, growing up as a child, you obviously had the classical side as well. What other music do you remember from your childhood that you enjoyed?
Excuse me. Well, it's actually my father, ran a hotel company in South Africa. That's it. And each hotel in those days, and they were five-star hotels, and each five-star hotel in those days had to have a cabaret room, a dinner cabaret room. Um, and so he he used to get a lot of um, artists, agents, and managers approaching him and sending him LPs, as they were in those days. Well, they are again now, actually,
Yes.
um, of different artists. And actually, I learned, someone like Victor Borge, um, who is, I'm sure you're aware of.
Oh, absolutely.
Um, Funny enough, I booked him for a show in London eventually, but he was one of the first people I listened to. Um, because his agent sent my dad an LP of a Victor Borge show because they wanted him to come to South Africa. And it was very funny, but also, there's he was he was a great pianist. I mean, he was a proper concert pianist, um, which some people sort of overlook uh, because of his comedy. Um, and so someone like Victor Borge, I learned about Tchaikovsky from him and Rachmaninoff. Um, and then I got to learn quite a lot about Chopin, who's still one of my sort of passions. Um, and started to play his music, um, mainly because I'm quite a sort of romantic in a way, and his music is extremely romantic. Um, uh, so I guess my influences were, in terms of classical music, were Chopin, Bach. There's a lot of Bach on the album that you know about. A lot of Bach, Scarlatti, the Italian composer. Actually, I was talking to Trevor Nunn last week, and he's just producing a play about the life of Bach,
Right.
which is going to be in the West End next month, I think. And he was saying, we were talking about Bach and that era and Handel, who both Bach and Handel, I don't know if you know, were actually born in the same year and died in
Yes,
the same
absolutely.
year. And although they never met, um, and Scarlatti was the same era. Um, and there's one that we record actually that I recorded of Scarlatti of a thing called the Cat Fugue, and Trevor said, "No, I've never heard of the Cat Fugue." And I said, "Well, the legend goes that Scarlatti had a cat, and one day it jumped up on his keyboard and walked across the keyboard and just played random notes." And uh, 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 Scarlatti heard this, and he said, "Yeah, I can work with those notes." And he created the Cat Fugue, which was an amazing piece of
Right.
random notes that made sense of into a fugue. Um,
It is wonderful that where this sort of inspiration for different songs come from, which is
yeah,
interesting. And
yeah, actually, yeah, I mean, how that came about, me telling Sir Trevor about that was that he said in the play about Bach, a lot of court composers were very jealous of him. And one day, King Ferdinand, uh, who was his patron, got up with some notes, random notes in his head, and wrote them down and sent them to his court composers and said, "Can you compose a fugue out of this, out of these notes? I just woke up with them in my head." And they all said, "Oh, that's they didn't like they weren't they didn't think they could do it." So they said, "Well, give it to Bach. He's such a genius. Let him do it." And he did. So that's what brought the cat fugue into the conversation.
brilliant. I
Um,
love that sort of stuff. So
uh,
really, really, I mean, apart from the classical side, I mean, you as you say, you had a very wide taste in music. Do you remember the first record you bought?
yes, it was Pat Boone. You're probably too young to have heard of Pat Boone.
No, I've heard of Pat Boone, even though I am still
Well,
young. But
and
yes,
it was because my brother Peter, my older brother, was a big Elvis fan, and I was a big Pat Boone fan. And it is called Johnny Will. There was nothing classical about it, but it was a very nice song. That's the first. That is the first 45 I ever bought.
Right. No, glorious. Well, you yourself, like most people, they want to be part of a band. You actually followed that up, and after you left St George's College in Weybridge, you set up your own classical rock band, Misty, in the late 1960s. You were the leader and keyboard player, as well as the composer, arranger. What prompted you to start your own band?
No, well, Andrew, I mean, I had bands through my teens. I played in, I learned jazz. I mean, particularly Hammond organ was my main instrument as well as piano. And Jimmy Smith, who you may or may not know, but Jimmy Smith is the greatest jazz organist that's ever lived to date. Um, and I once shook his hand, actually, which I'm very proud of. He had
You've never
huge
washed it
hands.
since.
Uh,
You've never washed your
sorry.
hands since.
He had huge hands. And um, uh, yeah, so jazz organ, I sort of got into jazz organ a lot, and then groups like the Animals came along. Alan Price is one of my big heroes in life, and I got to know him very well, and he's become a good friend over many years. Um, who was the organist and is credited with composing House of the Rising Sun. Um,
It's my go-to. It's the one I can do. I think karaoke. It's the easiest one for me to do.
oh, okay, yes, I guess. Yeah, I guess it isn't too difficult. Um, but so I had a jazz band. In fact, my first ex-wife um, was my first drummer's ex-wife. Well, she was his wife at the time, but he was a very good drummer. I'm sorry to have lost him, but he was a good jazz drummer, and a school friend of mine, John Lillis, he learned guitar and became a very good musician actually, and that was when we were about 14, 15 years old. And then I joined a semi-professional group called the Gremlins, and we still are in touch with each other
Right.
after 65 years or something. Um, and then a band called the Sonny Burke Show, where I met, which was quite a well-known soul band in London when I went professional, and that's where I met Steve Bingham, who is the other founder of Misty with me, who's a fabulous bass player, and also now manages and plays with Gino Washington and the Slim Chance, which is this offshoot of the Small Faces. So that's where I met Steve, and we got together, and we both thought, we want to do more than just play soul music. And formed Misty, and wrote the things that you've heard.
Oh no, fantastic. Well, hot cinnamon. Here we are. I tried to get all the props out here. So
Very good, very good. I'm
it's
glad
all got to be good.
you've done your
I've done my preparation, Michael. It's always got to combining restaurateur with music. It's got to be good. The hot cinnamon. So, tell me about that, because that was the most famous one to start with, wasn't it? In 1970, it was released as a single then.
Well, it was released, and but as you know, Lord Grade, Michael Grade, now Lord Grade, was our agent, and he was a very good guy, but he didn't really. He ran a company called London Management, which you may or may
Yes,
which was
absolutely, very famous.
probably the biggest variety agency in the country. They also had what they call the legitimate a division which looked after people like Michael Caine, Sean Connery, and people like that as well. But he didn't really have, in those days, our kind of music, progressive music, was popular mainly on the university circuits, and what they used to call the social secretaries of these universities were very powerful. and they would book all the bands for the various concerts and festivals that went on at universities. And uh, uh, but London management weren't in that world at all, which was which was a shame. But Michael loved the kind of music, and he loved our music. You know, I always say we were his first and his last rock band.
Right.
Um, um, but you know, he became a very good chairman of the BBC.
Oh, yes, no, he did his stuff. I think having looked after you, he went on to greater things, didn't he?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, at the time, actually, he was quite, you know, he and his father and Lou Grade, of course, and Bernard Delfont. I knew them all three of the brothers that, of his uncles and his father. I was very fortunate to have met all three of them because they were the dynasty that made the media and entertainment business in this country. In many ways, they were, you know, Russian immigrants who who made the business here.
Oh no, no,
Um,
absolutely. And we've had Ian Friedman, who's a mutual friend, and obviously
yes,
part
well, Ian,
of that
absolutely.
family. He's been on the show talking about that sort of side. Going back to the single "Hot Cinnamon," what's it all about? What does it mean?
Nothing. Nothing at all. Don't ask me.
But
Those
that's what I
days,
love is the honesty about it. That you sort of talk about, and people that they always try and analyze things, don't they? It's like if you ask an artist, you suddenly turn around and say, well, this artist they drew a blue door and it had this meaning about deep and depressed and so on and
yeah.
so forth,
Well,
and they turn around
some
and
of
say it's
the
just a blue
yeah.
door,
No, Hot Cinnamon. I no. Well, I didn't write it actually. Steve Bingham wrote it.
right?
But you know, he wrote some very off left field things, and it's quite funny because I did an interview recently with a Texan TV company
Yes.
about Misty because they somehow their music man had heard about us in Texas, would you believe? Um, and he wanted to do a Zoom interview like this. And
Nothing's like this, Michael.
what? So nothing
Nothing's
like
like
no, no,
this.
no, 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 almost like this, but not as good. Okay. um, and he'd done his research like you, and he'd listened to every track on the album. I mean, he was obviously a music sort of buff, and he knew details of it. It was quite impressive. He knew all of the details of the tracks, and he said, you know, but I particularly like that song, one of your tracks called Julie. It's such a happy. I said, no, that's a happy sort of bouncy thing, you know. I said, no, that's actually about a girl who commits suicide. You need to listen to the end, and if you listen to the words, it's actually about a girl who is physically impaired and commits suicide. He said, oh,
I know, and
really?
it is fun. And you do need to listen to the words and so on and so forth. And that's why it's interesting to unpack it. Some songs are just about lovely melodies and words and so on and so forth. Others have
Yeah,
stories
yeah,
behind it.
that's nice.
But tell me, you had Hot Cinnamon, which was the single released, but you recorded an album on acetate, but that was not released at the time. Why was that?
Um, well, Michael Gray got you know, his uncle was Bernard Delfont, Lord Delfont, and who was on the board of EMI. So obviously, you know, the obvious sort of route to getting a recording contract was EMI and Parlophone, which was the Beatles label. And Michael got us onto Parlophone. But Parlophone was not a progressive rock label. It was a pop label. Uh, and anyway, they released Hot Cinnamon. I don't maybe slightly under direct because of the connections. Um, and but basically didn't want to go any further. And Michael, you know, but as I said, Michael was quite sort of determined about things, and but he realized then that really, it wasn't his bag in terms of business, although he loved the music. So he took us to a company called Red Bus. And Red Bus is a very well-known record label and company. They just had a huge hit with Mungo Jerry.
No, no, absolutely. Red Bus is fantastic. You don't mind being thrown under the red bus.
No, no, it's run by a very lovely, a good friend of mine called Elliot Cohen, um, and still very successful. And they had a lot of banana rama and a lot of good acts on their catalog. But uh, anyway, Elliot, and he always nowadays we joke that it was a bit like Decca and the Beatles. He said he didn't want us, and he turned Michael down, and they would have been actually much better for us than London management would have been. But actually, so basically the album just. In fact, I didn't even know I had it still. I mean, this was 35 years later, or nearly 40 years later, I think probably. That a girlfriend of mine who was a violinist and a friend of my right-hand man at the time, a friend of his girlfriend. One Sunday morning we got up and she said, we were just sort of pillow talking, and she said, Jim says you made an album once. I said yes. She said, well, where is it? I'd like to listen to it. I said, I don't know where it is. I don't think I don't think I've got it. And anyway, she started rummaging through my albums, and incredibly, she found a copy of the acetate of the album, which an acetate was just a demo disc basically. It wasn't supposed to last more than about 6 months.
Right.
This was 35 years later. um, anyway, she looked at it and she said, "Is this it?" It was just a white cover with Misty written in small letters on the top. And I said, "Yeah, I think I think that is." And anyway, she put it on the turntable, which I had in those days. I have one again now, but uh, and it worked. And I had it remastered um, by a company that my son recommended because he's a technician. He said, "Go to this place called Porky's in Shaftesbury Avenue
Yes.
in London, and they will what's called digitally enhance it, take the scratches out of it and make it pristine." And I took it there, and they said, well, if you come back in next week on Thursday or something, it'll be ready. And I ordered 50 copies of it, and anyway, I went back, and they said, yeah, it's all here ready for you. I paid, and they said, but our boss would like to meet you. And I said, well, really? Well, what? I paid the bill, haven't I? um, they said, yes, yeah, but he thinks he's heard this music before. I said, he hasn't heard this music before anywhere. He said, well, he'd like to meet you. I said, okay. Well, so this guy called Porky came in, um, quite a big bloke, as Porky would be. And uh, he said, who is this band? What's the history of this band? And I said, well, it's a band that comes from, years ago. He said, yes, but he said, who are they? I said, the band called Misty, and we recorded this album years ago. I didn't say it was me, actually. I said it was a friend of mine.
Yes.
And and he said, okay. He said, I was the musician in those days. I said, yes. He said, yeah, I was in a band called The Foremost. I said, you were in The Foremost? He said, yes, because The Foremost was a Liverpudlian band that had two or three, the Beatles era kind of thing, the Liverpool era. And I said, oh, okay, yes, you have heard this music before. Because we did the one tour that Michael Gray got us was the Roy Orbison,
Right. Brilliant.
supporting Roy Orbison. And the Foremost were on the same bill as us. and it wasn't really, again, it wasn't ideal for us because Roy Orbison is a big pop star, and middle-aged housewives weren't really our thing at the time. Um, but he said, I knew I'd heard some of this music before. I said, my God, you got a good memory, because that was 40 years ago. And anyway, so I got a very good copy of the CD, and then later I was persuaded by, as you know, I'm involved with Boysdale Restaurants, which is some very good sort of music club restaurants in London. By the music editor of because we also have a glossy magazine called Boysdale Life, by the music editor Jonathan Wingate, and he wrote a piece for the magazine called the Rocking 60s or something like that. And I just wrote to him. He did, I knew him well, and said, I don't know if you ever knew, but I actually recorded an album in the 60s. And he got very interested, and he found the album on Spotify, would you believe?
Right.
And he said, he rang me a couple of days later. He said, I've heard your album. It's great. Well, what are you doing with it? I said, I'm not doing anything with it at the moment. So he's the one that convinced me to find a record company, which is Cherry Red, and Grapefruit record label. And so it was released just a couple of years ago on
2022, and here we are. We have the very album here.
Oh yes.
Brilliant, you see. I have a rare unsigned copy.
Well, they only printed 1,000 and they've sold them.
No, phenomenal stuff, and people should get hold of a copy. We're going to get you back onto the show. There's lots more to unpack about your glorious career and about Misty and your experiences. But very, very briefly, very quick fire questions. What's been your proudest moment?
I think doing my deal with 28 years old with Trust House Forte, and it was in the Times. It was in all the nationals. I was the youngest managing director to report to a FTSE 100 company in the UK, and I think because I went to them with an idea and they took up the idea, which I'm very eternally grateful to them for. And we did, and as Dennis Hearn, the CEO, said, you delivered on that idea, blue chip style, Michael.
Brilliant. Okay. Biggest regret?
Well, there's lots of those. That's the top 10. Biggest regret? I've got I think my last divorce.
Okay, well, we will be unpacking that, and I know you're book.
Oh, you don't want to go there.
Well, I think you are going there in your autobiography. We'll talk about that next time as well.
And my ex-wife wouldn't like to read it either.
Oh, well, there you go. I'm sure the lawyer's already poised.
Yes, I've already had various death threats.
And finally, Michael Gelardi, how would you like to be remembered?
I think just as a decent person, Andrew, which I hope I am. A lot of women might not agree, but I think I've had my moments. But no, I think I like anyone, and hopefully a good musician, which is quite dear to my heart.
And like the restaurant which we started with, would you be remembered as a bit of a flirt?
Sorry?
Would you like the restaurant, like your restaurant which you own?
Yes, but I like.
Are you a bit of a flirt?
No, I don't want to be arrogant about it. I think that most women in my life have hit on me, not the other way around.
Okay. Fantastic stuff.
I'm actually quite shy, Andrew.
Quite shy and retiring. It's always good.
Yes.
Michael, it's been a delight having you on the show. We look forward to having you back.
And
now, Michael Gelardi, thanks very much.
Thank you.